Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest Zoom event of the Canadian International Council. My name is Dan Sutherland. I'm president of CIC Saskatoon, broadcasting you today, Monday, March 18th, 2024, from the University of Saskatchewan campus here in the beautiful Saskatoon, 52 degrees north, 106 degrees west. The time is 6:03 Saskatchewan time, 8:03 Eastern, 5:03 Pacific. Out here, we've had a sunny day. We've got up to about +10, but we're back down to the lows near -20 for the rest of the week, so it's not quite spring here yet. Thank you, everyone, for having joined us here this evening. A number of people have been asking that we continue at least a few of our events in the Zoom format. For a lot of us, particularly in the more remote branches, we might not normally get a chance to have one of these speakers, let alone three, travel out to our locations for us to be able to hear them in person. Indeed, for the larger national community, it's a boon for us across the country to be able to see a much wider variety of international speakers speak than what we might normally have opportunity for. I take this opportunity to thank our audience, and I very sincerely wish to thank tonight's speakers who have taken time out of their schedules to be with us. A big thank you to Bogdana and Robert of the NATO Association of Canada for their work in pulling this together. Tonight's topic is NATO's 75th anniversary, Canada's role in the alliance. April 4th, 2024 will mark 75 years of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in ensuring the collective defense of its member countries through political and military means. This year's anniversary is an auspicious milestone, given the increased profile in the news as Russian aggression expands to the West. The threats of cyber terrorism are ever increasing, and the alliance is expanding its membership in response to this global instability. In recognition of this landmark, we've invited our following guests to speak on this topic. I really want to do the full introduction of them to you before we hear from them individually. Mr. Robert Baines is President and CEO of the NATO Association in Canada, where he is focused on communicating the importance of NATO and the international rules-based order to Canadians. The association is a charitable nonprofit which hosts events across Canada, publish hundreds of articles online every year. You've probably seen them on the news lately, and engages young Canadians about NATO through social media. Dr. Anessa Kimball, the author of Beyond 2%, NATO Partners, Institutions, and Burden Management, is Professor of Political Science, Director of the Center for International Security at École supérieure d'études internationales at Université Laval, as well as co-director of two themes for the Canadian Defence and Security Network, Security: Climate security and NATO. For over 2 decades, Dr. Kimball has used quantitative methods and rational institutionalist approaches to examine the institutional design of defense and security cooperation arrangements and defense burden sharing. We'll soon be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Johns. He's ex-commander, Leadership Development Training Element, Operation UNIFIER in Latvia. Lieutenant Colonel Johns recently returned from Latvia, where as the course director, he stood up the new Leadership Development Training Element under Operation UNIFIER umbrella. The LDTE instructs Ukrainian officers on brigade level tactics and maneuvers. While there, Lieutenant Colonel Johns traveled to the Security Assistance Group Ukraine in Germany, including briefing them on the courseware and obtaining NATO standardization approvals, and Poland to coordinate with the multinational brigade. He also briefed the Latvian National Defense Academy on the way forward for training and doctrine related to Canadian and international support for the war in Ukraine. We will start with Mr. Robert Baines.
There we go. Thanks so much. It's an absolute honor to have join me here tonight. Have the opportunity to kind of give you a bit of a NATO 101. Obviously, it's a big year for the alliance, and in the past 2 years, it has been more and more important around the globe, and certainly to Canada and the rest of our fellow members. I usually like to try to start off by taking a few steps back and looking at the origins of NATO. Most Canadians don't necessarily get to read about the history of NATO and understand the depths from which it emerged. And by depths, I mean conflict, suffering, and death. It's really one of those amazing institutions that has slowly pretty much evolved out of a lot of the troubles that we had in the 20th century. Taking a look back at the First World War, I think it's important to just recognize that at the end of the First World War, pretty much the entire world and certainly all of Europe and North America was determined to never have a major conflict like that again. The industrial scale killing machines of the trenches in the First World War were just anathema to most humans. I mean, it was just unimaginable. It was the war to end all wars. In the 20s and the 30s, there were populations in all of the countries of Europe and North America determined to make sure that that was the case. Pacifism started growing significantly. Ideas about international collaboration and multilateral organizations such as the League of Nations came up. There was a really, what shall I say, just a genuine desire for peace. The Oxford Union, which was perhaps the greatest debating society, student debating society in the world, had a debate in the 30s that said, I will by no means die for king and country. Be it resolved that I will by no means die for my king and country. And that debate won by an overwhelming, resounding amount. And it just that was just a few short years before the outbreak of the Second World War. So you can get this whole idea of how much people wanted peace and to stay out of war, to not build, giant fleets or, a industrial scale, building tanks and artillery again in a way that would perhaps be belligerent. You can quite understand a lot of the appeasement that happened in the 30s. There was just this huge desire for peace. The problem that was later discovered after the outbreak of the Second World War is that genuine desire for peace alone is not enough to maintain peace. That was just the huge lesson of the First and the Second World War. There's just no way that you can maintain that unless you have strength. In the Atlantic Charter of 1941, when Churchill and Roosevelt first met, they started envisioning what a world would look like after the Second World War. And that was all about non-zero sum collaboration. Many hands making light work. The whole key was that everybody can be part of an organization, put a little bit in, and get a huge amount out of it. And that is the same for the UN, for NATO, for so many organizations. But for peace specifically, it was revolutionary. I remember when I first learned about NATO, I definitely didn't quite understand how amazing it was. Just the simple idea that an attack upon one is an attack upon all, how much that would be able to truly maintain peace. It really started striking me when I thought of it in a just a regular human context. If you're in a bar or a busy place and somebody starts picking on you, big bald man perhaps who likes to hang around with tigers with his shirt off, starts coming up to you and pointing his finger in your chest. Best way bar none of stopping conflict in such a situation is making sure you've got a group of people behind you. Being able to point to the hockey team at the bar to say, oh, just FYI, before you touch me, I'm with these guys. And if you've got something to some beef with me, you've got beef with them. I think every Canadian, everybody on earth would recognize the kind of lumberjack sense of justice that is. Easy way of making sure that nobody starts a fight. And if they do, it makes sure that you can deal with it. So the whole idea of deterring through strength, maintaining peace through strength, it is the simplest idea that NATO has, and it's one that can't be said enough, frankly. It is the one great insight we had from all of the death and suffering of the two world wars. And when Anessa follows up, she'll be talking quite a bit about our defense spending and 2%. What are we supposed to be doing? That's right off of Article 3, which is the article in NATO which talks about having to be prepared. Nobody's going to trust a group of people if they're not training, if they don't have the right equipment, if they don't know how to work together, which is a huge thing as well. These are all the great advantages of NATO, and it's something that Canada has been able to be on from the ground floor in 1949, which means that we've built our militaries around this alliance. I'd go so far as to say it is, our number one grand strategy as far as our world affairs are concerned. That is the compass point to which we develop everything we're doing, and to not be towing our weight, which we'll get into a little bit later. As far as what we said we would do, what we signed on to, is concerning. I thought I'd talk just a little bit about what NATO's doing at the moment, and why it's important to Canada. I think most people who are listening are no stranger to the absolute craziness of the news. What's been called a poly crisis, just a laundry list of challenges that have beset the entire globe, and what's called the rules-based international order. An order of rules and institutions that are problem-solving. They don't always work together terribly well, but it is like an ecosystem. They all try to maintain a world where we run things through rules, through the rule of law. The idea that justice should be decided by rules, not by power alone. And it's worth me mentioning as well that NATO itself, very, very often people will see it as kind of just an American hegemonic empire, as we've seen throughout history. There's always a great power, and they may bring friends and allies around them when they're doing anything of import internationally. Well, the reason that that's different in the case of NATO is just the simple idea of consensus, which means that every country that's part of it has a veto in what's going on, which can be remarkably annoying and frustrating for everybody. But the fact that we get things done, the fact that you can do tremendous things, you can agree on how we are going to move forward, what direction our alliance is going in. It never ceases to amaze me, frankly. And the one reason that works is because it is a military, political, and diplomatic alliance, wherein the relationships that are formed between our diplomats, between our military members, those help to propel the alliance. So our ambassador to NATO, for instance, David Angel, he gets his marching orders from our Global Affairs Canada as far as what Canada wants, what our line is on various subjects, and then he negotiates with his friends, the people he knows, the people he trusts at NATO HQ, our other ambassadors who are representing our fellow allies. And so in a way, they're able to negotiate just through pure trust. And I should also say that our ministers of defense, foreign affairs, our chiefs of defense staff are meeting every 2 months, and very often more than that, so that they really develop this trust, and this ability to understand each other cuts through so much that could be troublesome, that could cause serious misunderstandings. And so these are the kinds of advantages that so few people get to see, and that I'm privileged to see, once in a while. And every time I do, I want to make sure that Canadians understand that is the true strength of the alliance. The alliance would not work if we didn't have the trust behind it. And we'll probably get more into that in a little bit. But it's a tremendous work of human achievement. And so one of those things that you could see if this had existed centuries ago, it would have worked, albeit differently. But it's the principle behind it that took just so much work to uncover this idea of non-zero sum collaboration. And Canadians have to understand that that is the only way that we are going to be able to flourish in the future. If America does decline or turns inward, Canada has to be among a group of nations that help to shoulder the greater burden of international policing, international leadership, essentially. A group of middle powers could very well do a significant amount. At the moment, if the United States kind of just says, no, thank you very much, we're out of NATO, that would be an absolute disaster and it would be tremendously difficult. But we can work to a point where more countries do more, and therefore that would be less of a danger of an immediate emergency in the medium term. And I think that's one of the things that Canada has to stand up for. It's in our values and in our interest. We want to preserve the world we have. NATO helps us do that. So many other institutions do as well. So I'll just leave with this, but so many politicians of all parties are often saying, well, it's very difficult to be door knocking when you've got citizens, Canadian citizens, who are quite rightly concerned about education, health, social services, and then tell them, well, we're actually going to have to cut a bit back on all of those to maintain security. And Anessa is going to continue on this, I'm sure. But the Canadian public, we need to make sure that all of our consciousness are raised so that we understand that security is an invisible, woven piece of infrastructure undergirding all of those elements under our health, under our education and welfare systems. Security is that thing without which none of those things can exist. And it's not just somewhere overseas. It is indivisible. It will, if it's degraded in one part of a world, we'll see it affecting others. And I think we're seeing that right now. I was just mentioning before we started here, I am optimistic. We have this amazing tool. NATO is an inspiring organization full of amazing people. The terror is that we just don't support it as much as it deserves and as much as it needs. And that's upon many shoulders. But it's just, we need to make sure that we utilize the tools that have been forged out of so much pain and suffering of the past. I think that's beholden to us as Canadians who stand up every November 11th and recognize that suffering without recognizing the brilliance of the society that has maintained. That's my opening gambit.
Hear, hear. Okay, we'll move on to Dr. Anessa Kimball.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. And so, Robert talked a bunch about kind of this, how we can situate the historical context of NATO. And so I'm going to talk a little bit maybe about the political context and also try to kind of bring some of those messages home in a way that maybe may recast NATO in a way that Canadians have not classically thought about it. And so first off, why we should care about NATO. Obviously, we have this historical context, but as voters in Canada, you should care about NATO because defense is the fourth largest portfolio that our government manages. And by that I mean that it's behind employment and workplace integration, development, revenue, and treasury. So basically, after we pay off people and we pay off the government, we pay for defense. And that's really important because that really underlines the essentialness of defense for the territory and sovereignty of Canada, right? And so we talk about with alliances how there's this kind of sovereignty and autonomy, this security autonomy trade-off, right? That you give up a little bit of your policy autonomy, but you get security in exchange, right? And so one of the ways in which we talk about NATO is that it's one of these, for Canada at least, it's a security autonomy trade-off alliance, right? When we talk about NATO from a US perspective, we talk about it more about how this permits the United States maybe to have influence in other countries. Another way that political scientists talk about NATO and talk about international commitments is the way in which these commitments tie our leaders' hands by invoking audience costs. And so what we mean is that, basically international alliances, Canada has committed to collectively defend its partners in NATO. And leaders will call upon those promises, and we know that they do this, for example, in political party platforms. If you look, their political party platforms, they're littered with references to NATO and NORAD in these commitments, right? And so these are ways in which our politicians will mobilize, spending on defense and keeping our defense credible, because we have to remain credible in the context of those commitments. And what is interesting and important is that through multilateral institutions, Canada is able to obtain a level of defense and security that it could never obtain alone. Right? It could never protect its north and do everything that NORAD does alone. Right? It could never do all of the various kind of defense and security cooperation with all of these 31 European partners, right? 30 European partners in the United States, that it does through NATO. It could never do that bilaterally, one-on-one, right? And so there are these various other things that are extremely important that we draw from NATO that we don't really recognize every day. And of course, NATO is a major source for our armed forces missions over the last several years. And so when you talk about the things that we spend on and the things that we do with our defense forces, NATO, and I say this because our politicians tend to, I want to say, maybe miscommunicate the discourse a little bit, because they talk about Canada as being a peacekeeping nation. But the reality is Canada trains peacekeepers. We do not send very many of our troops to peacekeep these days. And so if you're looking at what are the things that make Canadian boots and our military advisors go in to foreign countries, and kind of defend, it's NATO these days. And so, we did the UN back in the 90s and in the early 2000s, but I mean, we have to be realistic. Since Afghanistan, NATO has been this source of what has brought Canada abroad to collaborate with partners. And also, I think that in terms of tying Canada's hands, it ensures that Canada is also, its military and defense is interoperable with 31 other countries in the world. You would not get that without NATO standards, regulations, protocols, and doctrine. And this is interesting because Canada is now also playing a role in terms of collaborating to lead a climate change center of excellence. And so in the next 5 to 7 years, Canada is going to be playing this really important role in helping our allies think about why and how, right, we can adapt and mitigate for climate change, not only with our defense forces, but also with public safety and security. And so this is where I want to talk about how we are recasting NATO when it comes to emerging security threats. The NATO of the Cold War that was in this kind of military and defense silo, that NATO is gone. The NATO of today is a NATO that is going outside of those silos and talks about public safety, public security, critical infrastructure, disaster relief. NATO taking on climate change is not only kind of emblematic about that, but it's also this kind of, it's a recognition that for nearly all NATO partners, with the exception of the United States, many of those militaries actually have disaster response mandates. This is something that they do. We don't talk about it very much because our major partner is the United States and their military doesn't do that, right? And so we've kind of handicapped ourselves a little bit there. And so leading this climate change center of excellence is going to allow Canada to kind of, recenter our thinking about that. It's going to allow us to kind of collaboratively lead with our 11 other partner countries. And this is also a way in which we may be able to reconcile some of those demands of military spending. The other thing Canada has done through NATO is it's committed to spending 2%. And just to give you an idea what that means, today we spend about 1.29%. This is around $29 billion. That's a lot of money. Remember, I told you it's the 4th largest portfolio. But to spend 2%, we would have to spend about $16 billion more to reach $40 billion. This is the size of our current Ministry of Science, Innovation, and Technology, or our current Ministry of Global Affairs. So we need to find a global affairs and give it to defense. And so it's important because this means that to do this, it's going to be all portfolios on deck. You cannot reach 2% spending without looking at every other spending that the government is doing. And so this is a public relations message. We have to get voters to understand Canada has made this commitment. And NATO is very important for Canadian defense and security. We would not want Canada to start to be isolated and marginalized outside of NATO. This would be very bad for Canada in many ways, and it would especially be very bad for Canada's defense, because we know our defense procurement is made credible, and it is practically motivated because of what we have to give to NATO, contribute to NATO, and what we have to contribute to NORAD, right? And so without those commitments, I think we all wonder very much what would be the state of Canadian defense. And frankly, those commitments make Canada a credible partner, because it has to be. And Canada's reputation matters very much to it. And so, in closing, I'd like to say, I think that, Canada's role in NATO, we talk a lot about Canada being a free rider. And, does Canada do enough? It doesn't reach the 2%. The reality is, I spent 4 months of 2023 in Central and Eastern Europe, and I talked to our partners in at least 10 different countries. And their viewpoint is Canada is not a free rider. They know that we are doing everything that we can do within what our capacity is. They are perhaps more pragmatic about the size of our military and our capabilities and our electoral constraints than we are ourselves, which I think is very interesting. And so when I was in the Czech Republic, our Czech partners, they don't think Canada is underperforming. They look at what Canada is doing in enhanced forward presence, and they're saying, how does Canada do that with so little, right? Canada underinvests. We have a small military, yet somehow we're standing around shoulder to shoulder with the top 5 partners in the alliance, right? And so instead of us asking, we know we're not doing enough, but we should also be a little more proud, because what we are doing is being recognized by our partners. And that is demonstrated by the fact that when Sweden joins our brigade in Latvia, 1 in 8 partners will be in that brigade, right? And so literally, that means 1 in 8 partners is looking to Canada to lead there. And this is why Canada's role in the alliance is important, and why, as we go into 75 years of NATO, I'm a kid of the Cold War. I grew up thinking about these things, and we went through that moment where we thought this was over and we're in the peace dividend. What we have learned in the last 2 years is that, our Eastern European partners never thought that there was a peace dividend. We sold that to ourselves in North America, because we like to be naive and lazy in Canada about defense. And that's just the start of my spicy takes. So I'm going to pass on over to Lieutenant Colonel, who will tell us about NATO as well.
Hear, hear. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, introducing Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Johns.
Hi, sorry, I was having some Zoom issues. So I was there, I heard my intro, it was awesome, but I was like, it did not appear and could not speak. So I was like, oh, well, that's the problem. So I had to rejoin. But you'd think I'd mastered technology by now, but no.
No one.
So I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's a super cool opportunity. As you heard, so I don't really work, and I have not particularly worked at high levels of NATO. However, I have done a lot of somewhat multilateral, but low-level multilateral. So I actually want to touch on some points that Anessa brought up. I was wondering if maybe we passed each other last year in Central and Eastern Europe, just without even meaning to. And in my previous position, I was the G3, the Chief of Operations for 1 brigade in Alberta. And one of the major tasks that I have to do is actually mandate, track our what we owe to NATO and our readiness for it and everything. And we did a lot of exercise, we did an actual whole exercise analyzing that and our capability and such. So it was very interesting. But I just want to say, I think both Robert and Anessa touch on things that are very personal to me in my view of NATO. I think it's a very important institution. I see some people who kind of increasingly, as we talked about a little bit about politicians that are kind of questioning this. I'm what are you doing? This is arguably like the single greatest alliance that has ever been created, like certainly in modern human history, but like and has done an amazing amount in terms of its ability to, for lack of a better term, keep the peace within reason. Understanding it's not completely successful, but it's probably kept a lot of things bottled up that would have been much more dangerous. So I do think it's something that needs to be explained better. I think there are a lot of citizens. I actually had this discussion today with some of my instructor staff at the staff college, that there are many citizens in this country who simply do not understand what NATO is. They don't understand much in the way of defense. Like these things are black boxes to them. Many have, I would say, also don't really understand how a lot of like the parliamentary system works. Like there is an unfortunate bleed over of like American, political culture of like how their elections work versus how ours work. I've been a polling officer for, people, and I've had like to explain how they actually have to vote. Like this is how you vote for someone. And I think we have, as Anessa said, like we have like reaped that peace dividend, but I think that is also Canada's entire history, since its founding really has been like we have an incredibly privileged position in the world, right? We have one neighbor who is the biggest kid on the block, and we get along with them mostly okay. So that makes you like we're a pretty safe place. And so we have this ability to kind of throttle our interest in defense. And when we don't have what we perceive as existential threats, and I as well, I'm a kid of the Cold War, and I remember existential threats of the Cold War. When we don't have that, well, it's very easy to kind of forget about it. It's just not a concern. But I will say, having just returned from Latvia, you talk to Latvians, and they do have an existential threat, right? They look across the border and they say, we consider Russia an existential threat to Latvia. We consider the war in Ukraine an extension of our policy of national defense, and that's how that is how we address it. And it is a bit of a reality check when you go there and say like, no, these people take, these areas take this much more seriously, whether or not they can afford to fund it, which I think is, like Latvia's military is 2 battalions, right? They don't even have a full brigade. Like their military is tiny. They fund what they can, but they take it. But to them, it is something they still take very seriously, and they take their concerns about security seriously. And they, like Anessa touched on, tie in other elements like that tie into their own national security that they see as just kind of part of that entire security. Really very bad at understanding. As someone from one brigade who has responded to about 1 million IRUs and domestic operation call-outs, like no, people don't take it seriously, and they don't generally understand like what the cost of that can be, which can be significant. So when we talk about initiatives like climate change, I have a degree in emergency management, so I'm like, yeah, this is fast, like great stuff. It's super important. Overall, this contributes to a culture of security, which I do think Canada, generally speaking, doesn't have much of one, and has not for quite a while. And I think that is a narrative that does need to be like just reinvigorated. And I don't know, I'm not a politician, I'm not an expert, what comes at that cost, but I think it's a discussion that needs to be had. And I think if you look at the last, probably going back all the way to the early 90s, like there has not been an election in Canada that has been fought over foreign affairs policy or defense policy since maybe the 80s, right? Maybe. We've fought elections over scandals related to like procurement, but not like actual policy, because we don't want to talk about policy because policy is complicated. But Canada does do an incredible amount. So the mission that I just came back from, UNIFIER, which is the standing Canadian mission to support the training of Ukrainian soldiers, we stood up a very short notice task where we sent a very small team of Canadians. We sent 10 Canadians, and we paired with 6 Latvians, and we trained 350 Ukrainian officers in like battle group operations. And we had to show up and just make a course. They're like, make a course, translate it into Ukrainian, and teach it. Go. And so we did that, and we went to the SAGU in Germany, just the Security Assistance Group Ukraine, which is run by an American 3-star. And they're like, this is what we want them to learn. We said, okay, we can teach this. And we leaned very heavily on NATO doctrine. Initially, we did Canadian because we came from the staff college, and then very rapidly realized, no, NATO is what we should be using. We went to NATO doctrine. It works really well for this. But that was a team of 10 Canadians, which, you know, we were dealing directly with the chief of defense in Latvia, the chief of their defense academy, the Canadian ambassador. Like, we, you know, like I was going down to the Lithuanian, Polish, Ukrainian multinational brigade, and it opened those doors. And very much, like Anessa said, like Latvia looks at what Canada does, and they are flabbergasted by it. And they're to them, and they will tell you, like, this team of 10 people, they're like, this means so much to us, because they see that as an extension of their policy of defense, that we are helping them. Now, in terms of like the exact calculation, this 10 random staff officers, you know, who do nothing but drink coffee and read PowerPoints, like, do we contribute to the EFP or anything? Absolutely not. We are technically not even part of NATO. Like, it's not a NATO mission. It's like a NATO, UNIFIER is a NATO adjacent mission, because the NATO nations do not train Ukraine directly for logical kind of political firewalling. All the NATO nations train Ukraine, but NATO does not train Ukraine, is a good way of putting it. Collectively, the alliance does not. But so we have that, you know, overlap. But it was truly heartwarming, and like honestly, like really did blow me away the amount of recognition and support, like that, especially like in the Baltic region and down into parts of Eastern Europe and stuff, where people look at Canada and say, like, no, like, you are players, like, you are serious contenders here. Like Anessa said, like, you are one of the top 5. And in many cases, many of those smaller countries like Latvia, you know, they could have the Americans put an EFP, you know, they could have asked the Americans to have an EFP, or they could get the Brits. But a lot of them do look at Canada and say, well, we kind of like you because you're not the Americans and you're not the Brits, right? You're like the big brother who comes and you know your stuff and you can help us and you bring a level of experience and skill that we want, but you also don't, as Robert said, like, you don't kind of come with like your hegemony of like, we're Americans, you're going to do everything we want because we're American. You're a bit more open to dialogue. And that was very much our approach, which they appreciated. The Latvians were like, well, like, you guys are the lead. We're like, yeah, but you're our partners here. You need to work with us. We want to work with you. And I think that, again, that's one of those things that Canadians do not realize, the sheer value that leveraging those relationships, like the trust that was touched on, like, can just be incredible. So the ambassador in Latvia, he's the ambassador for the Baltic region, but, you know, I was talking with him, and he was just like, this is like, the way like Latvia sees this is incredible. Like, your little training mission, but he's like, the value that this like just brings to me going into a room, because they see this as a commitment, right? And it's a commitment to help them. They have a shared history, a long shared history with Ukraine. So they see that as like, they're, you know, we are helping their greater community, and they respect that. They want that. So it does frustrate me when it's like the difficulty of explaining that sometimes to people, like, you know, the investment is, yes, it's a big portfolio, but like comparatively is quite small, but it involves so many additional impacts and benefits that are not necessarily directly tied to defense, right? Like NATO's Partnership for Peace program, and like the ability to potentially tamp down internal conflict or threats, to help modernize and work on anti-corruption and stuff through both NATO and then like in a paired system through GAC or other initiatives, like, but those things like all tie together. If you want to talk about security, you can have one element doing one thing, like, you know, NATO troops there working in a Partnership for Peace environment, which we were doing in Ukraine in 2017 when I was there. And then you can also bring in, you have GAC, or you have correction services or police services who are also providing additional training for other elements. But all those things do contribute to like that whole of reducing threat and reducing risk and increasing overall security and strengthening rules-based order, getting people, hey, we all follow these rules. It'd be great if you did too. And it's like, it seems very simplistic, but the fact is like, that is what it exists to do. And it does it very, very well. And Canada has played a great role in it. But whether we'll ever get to 2%, I think is an interesting discussion. But I do think a better approach, or a more logical approach, is to look at some of the other initiatives, and that NATO itself has gone beyond being a simple military. Like when it was originally established, it tended to be, it was very viewed as very much a military thing, and it is no longer that. It absolutely is not. It is a diplomatic, it is political, it has financial concerns, technological, like efforts to standardize equipment leads to new communication systems, which leads to new standards. Like all those things have to be considered together. And I think this is, again, we're very poor at selling this collectively to people. Like it's a simple idea with a lot of complex little bits attached to it, which make it's worthwhile. That's what makes it worthwhile. And people often either glaze over and say 2%, or why are we in Europe? And you're like, well, there's a lot of reasons this all plays in. And that I think is the crux of where Canada needs to go, is to really explain and learn to explain. And honestly, a lot of that is explaining internally to our own people, to our own citizens, like, why do we care about this? We do get a lot of benefits from this, both from like military training, going on exercises, our own deployed missions. But like, you can't go and be, a battle group or a brigade commanding force if you never get to do that stuff. Like, the first time you should do that is not when you're fighting a war, right? So we leverage those opportunities for a reason. And they're important. And I think it's just one of those things that I think a lot of the problem that NATO has, much like NORAD, is it's done its job too well in many ways. And so people kind of discount it as, oh, it's that thing, but like, we're not going to be nuked anymore, so it's fine. We don't have to worry about it. But if you look at it more as a concept of a security system that tries to create security and expand security collectively for the world in a lot of ways, and you start to account for things like instability brought about by climate change, or mass migration, or economic impacts, like suddenly, oh, it's actually like, it's doing a lot. It's like, it's the International Fire Brigade that's helping. But that, I think, is where it really struggles to get that message across. That's my kind of rambling 2 cents on it. But yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
That sounded really fantastic. Thank you very much. For the audience, if you do have questions, feel free to click on the chat button on the bottom of the Zoom window and type it in, and we'll do some sorting, and we'll get to you as quick as we can. We have had a couple of questions come.
You muted yourself there, Dan. Yep, you're muted.
I'm not too good with the tech. Taking a look at some of the questions that have come in. Oh, there's questions come up. What is the greatest threat to NATO in the near term? We can do a walk around with that question if anyone wants to jump into it first.
Sure. Well, Anessa's got a great insight on the multiplicity of different learnings that NATO's got to counter a lot of different threats. But if you do ever have a problem going to sleep one night, you can read the Vilnius Summit communique. It's not that long, actually. but it's from last summer, and it just goes through all of the various things that NATO does have in front of it, as what it's tackling at the moment, and it is a pretty impressive list. But for me, it's always going back to the basics. Unity and disunity specifically is the greatest threat to NATO. It always is. It's always that. If you read Article 5, which I'm not expecting any of you to do, but Article 5 only works if people agree on what the relationship is between the different nations. There are no specifics. Article 5 means an attack upon one is an attack upon all. The actual response to that could be sending boots. It could be sending med kits. It could be doing very minimal things. It's just every country has to do something. Now, if every country just sent med kits, then of course the alliance would essentially de facto be useless, and it would fall apart then and there. But the whole reason it doesn't is because of this constant communication and the unity of purpose. So, I mean, when the people bring up Donald Trump all the time, talking about how he has, through his kind of fear mongering, built up NATO defense budgets, and it's largely through a lot of fear of his repercussions if he took another term as president of the United States. What that would happen, what would occur if our NATO countries are not at 2% like he keeps banging away at. The reason that isn't as effective as you'd think it would be is because at the exact same time as he was doing that, he was destroying the trust at the basis of the alliance. And again, that's that trust that we will be there. 2% is our goal. We're all working towards it, but if nobody's at it at a particular moment, it's not like there's going to be an audit before all the allies jump in to protect you. It was that kind of challenge. As for my money, it's always going to be the greatest threat to NATO because it is so easy. If any of you have had a group of friends that have tried to accomplish anything over a long period of time, you get annoyed at your friends. One of them does something that's, heartbreaking or extremely rude. You can barely stand them. And that happens writ large. Very difficult to cut through all the misunderstandings and possible challenges that would occur to an alliance of this nature. So I just put that unity above all is the greatest challenge at the moment, and always.
If I could chime in, I think in terms of, I'm trying to recast it about thinking about what's the biggest threat to Canada and to NATO, right? And so I think one threat, and this is, it's been lurking at the margins, but we need to take it much more seriously, is there's a threat of Canada being lazy, right? Canada has let NATO do the heavy work, and really Canada has not had any kind of like independent autonomous reflection. Like, Robert, he evoked a little bit about this, and we talked a little bit about it before, how like Canada doesn't really have a grand strategy. It has NATO, and it's in NATO, and it's been lucky that NATO has worked, right? And this is related to the second threat that I think, and really it's the threat that Canada failed to learn from Trump, right? We experienced Trump. We know that was difficult. But I really don't think we internalized any way or strategy in which we can adapt or mitigate a future difficult US president. It doesn't have to be a Trump. It could be a Trump in the short term, right? But it could very well be somebody else in the next, 6 to 10 years. And I just don't think, and this is also sneaking at the margins of our allies, right? Canada could be learning right now from observing the divorce between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Nobody thought that was going to happen. And their largest, most important political and defense committee, the Intergovernmental Relations Committee, is suspended. I mean, this would be like the US-Canadian PJBD being suspended. If our permanent joint defense board was suspended with the United States, it would be like, a tremor shook the earth. And we're not talking about it. And also, both the Czechs and Slovaks are in our brigade. so we should care about this a whole hell of a lot. And so, you know, I think that it's really this laziness, and really this not learning when we should have, we could have, we know we should have. And that's what I'm worried about.
I'm not gonna say I think you're both right. um, it's just a super diplomatic Canadian military answer. You're both right. No, I think like Anessa's point kind of circles back to what one of mine, like about talking about NATO in general and security in general. And I think that it is reflective of the fact that for quite a long time, Canada has not, I would kind of say at the end of the Cold War, reaping the peace dividend, and Canada has not considered a lot of its challenges from a security point of view, like from a military security point of view, but also from like a political and international relations security point of view. And how do we ensure that we maintain the rules-based order? How do we ensure we keep what we need to function as a country? If a U.S. president, whoever, comes in and decides they are going to slam all their tariffs down, and do this kind of thing, which certainly, was threatened and sort of happened. But if something like that happened, and we're like, well, we'll just go appeal to the new, can't remember the new NAFTA's acronym, but we'll go appeal to the new NAFTA, court. Like, do we really think we're going to win that argument? Like, in the end, we might, but like, it will drag on forever. And like, whatever industry we hoped is going to be destroyed in the interim. Like, that's the thing, right? Like, we are still, no matter what, a medium power, and we exist somewhat buffeted by large powers, which means we have to ensure that we understand how to find our kind of like friends who we can work with to ensure our own support. And if something does happen, that we have options. And I'm not saying, oh, the United States is going to invade us, but a significant breakdown in military relationships or political or economic relationships would be incredibly damaging to us. And what are our options there? And I think we have been lazy. Like, I grew up during most of this period and lived my adult life during it, right? But like, I think we have been incredibly lazy as a country generally in trying to look at some of those more existential questions. Like, what do we really want? What are we willing to accept? Like, what cost are we willing to accept to ensure we can be independent in certain ways, but not in others? Like, where do we want to find ways where we have rapprochement with other countries, but where do we want to ensure we have like an industrial capability that allows us to do stuff, whether or not we have a good relationship with X country, because we think it's important. And very rarely do we have those discussions internally, which is, a big political debate to be had. I think it needs to be had. I don't know who's going to have that discussion anytime soon, but I think it's an important one. Like, what do we want as a country? Because that drives things like, what do we want the CAF to do? Do we want the CAF to just fight fires every summer? That is an option, and we can do that. But then, you know what? We might as well get rid of we'll get rid of our tanks, we'll get rid of our jets, because we don't need those to fight fires, if that's what you want us to be. But right now, I do think we keep kicking, but we're lazy in the sense we just keep kicking the can down the road. It becomes a discussion for the next government, the next group of people, the next generation will decide what we're going to do. And so we just kind of keep taking what we have and like stretch it a little bit more politically, economically, from a security perspective, and like, well, we can kind of make it fit across here. We can keep making it fit. I had a soldier who used the most amazing thing, because he's from Newfoundland. He said, look, I feel like bubble gum stretched over a 45-gallon drum. And I'm like, man, only a Newfie would use a statement like that. But that's like, sometimes we do, like, we're trying to put that pressure. Like, we want to be committed, but commitment comes with a cost.
Yeah.
And that's okay if we decide we want to bear that cost. But we have never actually discussed whether or not we want to bear the cost. We just kind of keep going like, we're kind of doing well enough. That's, I think, one of our big challenges from Canada's perspective but I think this then, like it can expand that to NATO. Like, what do you want NATO holistically to do? I think NATO has actually got a clearer mandate and is moving towards that. It struggles with unity, definitely, because we do have some member nations who, our relationship with them is sometimes fraught. They have political views that don't necessarily actually align super well, and we have, frictions there, which then potentially puts us in a case where, if you have a system that is based on consensus and you can't get people to agree for a variety of reasons or trying to leverage things, like, it is built on trust, and NATO is built on the idea that, yes, countries will always be looking out for their best interest, but it is built on the idea that collectively you're all working towards a goal. But as soon as people start feeling that individual members are trying to leverage the system or are trying to get something out of it, or push it a certain way because it's for their national interest only, then it starts to undermine the system as a whole. You're like, hey, whoa, like, what are you doing over there? That's not what we're talking about. So it goes back to Robert's point, like, yeah, like, who the heck is going to do an audit if, like, someone invades a country? Like, you can't say that. If you say that, then it means nothing. It's pointless. Whether or not, there's a 2% tax, that you've hit, or that you haven't paid your 2% tax, therefore we're not going to help you. Like, that's like saying, well, I pay my property tax, but I set my bill in, but it hasn't made it to the county assessor, so the cops just won't come to my house. Like, that's not how that works, right? Like, we have a society and a collective. We've agreed that this is the system, and we have to stick to that.
I'd also like to just follow up briefly too. It's interesting when we talk about the Canadian kind of thought space as well. We have, over the past year and a half, really started seeing a lot of content from Global Affairs, from Heritage Canada, from D&D. A lot of different departments are putting out kind of counter disinformation, or at least disinformation awareness. But we're not really giving a narrative in its place. We're just saying, oh, don't listen to that. Oh, no, that's all terrible. But we're not saying, and here's what we stand for. These are the things that are in that place. I mean, you'll see a couple of, statements about the rules-based international order, et cetera, but it's not really well articulated. And I do feel that we are in some ways kind of just ceding the space there for disinformation because it's a vacuum. We don't talk about that all that much in Canada. I mean, the three of you, tell me if you've seen, a campaign trying to articulate what it is that we're for. If it is, it's like a list of 2 or 3 things. Truth, independent judiciary, independent media, etc. But it's not. It's not something that you can grab onto as a story. An actual narrative. And I think that we're a little too afraid of that. And I've always felt very strongly about that.
So my wife is a comms officer, a civilian comms officer for defense, and you just made her little heart sing, because this is exactly it. Because I bug her about this all the time. I'm like, where is my narrative? Like, where's my story? I will say, actually, I was very impressed. The public affairs officer on UNIFIER recently was super motivated and got into basically kind of telling a story. And it was I was like, man, this is really, really good. But it was one guy on one mission. And where's my collective? This is what we're going towards. What do we want as a country? Which then drives, well, what are we going to bring to NATO? Which then goes back to Anessa's point. Well, we're going to provide this much military, but we're also going to be providing experts in the development of new communications technology and security technology through Development Canada, Science and Development Canada, which, although technically not military, is contributing directly to the development of this new thing for NATO. You could find those narratives. To do that, you have to know kind of what you want that narrative to be. And I agree. I don't think that we have. No one wants to discuss what do you want Canada to be and do in the end? What do you want us to do? Are we just going to be are we just going to be kind of this middle power that's there and, hey, we're here to help? like, I guess, but it's not a super compelling story, unfortunately. I would love to see a lot more like, yeah, unified comms, but like a unified, like, this is what we exist to do. And it is something that, for whatever reason, we are extremely reluctant on. And again, I think this goes back. It's not just this government; it's been previous governments. Like, it's just one of those things. We're kind of waffling in this like weird space right now.
Indeed. Another question that's come up regarding NORAD. Why does NORAD matter to NATO? And how have the Nordic countries been inspired by it?
Sure, I'll take this question because I also work a little bit on NORAD. And so, what is interesting is that the North American Aerospace Defense Command is the binational agreement with the United States, over which began, of course, in aero and in air defense, then moved to aerospace, and then after 9/11, we kind of enlarged it also to maritime surveillance and warning, right? And so it's an institution which checks various boxes that are very important for, kind of territorial defense and security. What is also interesting is, of course, that its look, at least in terms of its establishment, back in the 1950s, was a very, kind of Arctic, northern, looking towards those Russian bears, right? And so this is important because, in a very indirect but also quite important way, it's supporting NATO, because it's supporting that kind of transatlantic Arctic swath of security that's very important, and is becoming increasingly important with climate change, and with increasing traffic, for example, in the Arctic, with what we know are ever increasing air incursions into the space, particularly by China. And so these are the types of things that NORAD reacts to more and more these days, but it's been doing this for a number of years, kind of very silently. But what's more interesting is that last year, the 6 Nordic countries, their air defense commanders signed a letter of intent, which created a kind of a Nordic version of NORAD Light. And so their version does not do kind of the maritime aspects, right? Because these were only the air commanders. But what is interesting is that they have now, as opposed to having 6 separate zones of air defense, they now have merged this into one zone, as we did in North America, right? And so effectively, those gaps in seams now reduced drastically, because instead of having to patrol all of those lines, you've created one big air zone. And so this is strategically really interesting for both NATO and for Canada, and for the Arctic. The other thing is that they took this zone, and they've also decided that they will dedicate a fleet of 150 F-35s eventually to this zone. And so what that means is that within a couple of years, our Nordic partners will actually be able to have a bit of a price tag on what NORAD would cost a little bit, right? They have been free riding off, kind of North America, those Arctic countries. And so now they're going to kind of get a little bit of an idea of what it means to do that, and what that collaboration is, how much it costs, and all of that. And so we know that these countries have a very strong history of collaboration and defense. And so I'm looking to this with a lot of interest. And of course, Canada should be looking at this as well, because, these are countries, this is all the adjoining region. And so what does this, what does this mean for NORAD? I think, Canada should be thinking about, could they be an observer in this type of institution? All of these things would be wonderful for Canada's air defense and kind of their situational awareness. And so I think that that's a very clear way in which we see a complementarity between NORAD and between NATO, and also ways in which we're seeing these complementarities with our Scandinavian and Nordic partners that we know. Of course, Finland and Sweden just joined NATO. And so this also is opening much more opportunities for Canada in terms of new partners to collaborate with, but also in terms of kind of thinking about that area of the world and kind of coming to a closer kind of defense and security collaboration with those countries. You know, we had kind of been talking with them, but now we can really collaborate in an interoperable sense because we have that shared NATO framework. And that's where we come back to NATO as kind of this common language, right? And it's a common language between the NATO partners, but also with the Partnership for Peace and with NATO's global partners. And so here we're talking about Japan, South Korea, Australia. And so really when you take this set that is NATO and you kind of enlarge it, you're getting upwards of around, 50 or 60 countries. And so again, that you've put all of these countries together around these three baskets, which are cooperative security, collective defense and deterrence, crisis prevention and management, is something that is worth, stewarding. It is something that's worth protecting. And it's also something that's worth communicating its importance to fellow Canadians, to young Canadians, to voters, because again, we make these choices about our politicians and they're the ones that go out there and are really kind of approving spending the money and approving some of these big projects. Thank you.
That sounds great. Robert or Lieutenant Colonel, would you like to
The
add
only thing
anything?
I'd mention is Lieutenant General Frawley, who's the deputy commander of NORAD, just spoke a couple of weeks ago and was mentioning, just kind of the collaboration between NORAD and NATO is not a huge amount. It's more just like checking in and keeping comms going. That exact question came up. So he did mention that there was obviously they were always keeping each other aware of what was going on, but it's not they're two quite separate areas of operation there.
Well, lots of food for thought there. Let's see, a couple more questions have come up. Can Canada reach the 2% GDP military spending promise that it made to NATO?
Sure. I'll field that question because, yeah, I wrote a book on it, so I guess I'm the one. So I think one thing that's important is that we need to separate out kind of how we measure the defense spending and what we mean by NATO defense expenditures. So there are other things that we can add into that pocket that count for NATO defense expenditures. And so one of the things that Canada is actively doing now is talking with NATO partners, because remember that definition of NATO defense expenditures dates to 1952. And so it's been updated to kind of include things like Joint Forces Command and cyber and STRATCOM and all of that, but it hasn't really been updated in the broader sense of, for instance, how NATO has gone outside of the defense silo. Right. And so aspects of, for example, public security spending that would be relevant for humanitarian, for environmental disaster. Right. Those types of things may not necessarily be included in our defense spending, because based on what I look at and what I hear Canada reporting, we are simply just taking that raw number on defense spending. And so the first thing, Canada needs to make sure that it's reporting everything. We can work on that definition of defense spending. And so I've suggested that we start talking to our allies about kind of broadening that. And so there are two ways in where I think that Canada can help itself. One way would be to try to talk to our partners and allies and get them to consent to Canada's spending for Arctic and Northern infrastructure and technology development to be covered, right? And this is because NATO is going in the Arctic, right? NATO has decided that the Arctic is now part of its kind of extended territory. Jens Stoltenberg visited the Arctic for the very first time as SecGen, and it was the Canadian Arctic. It was not in Norway. It was not in those Nordic partners. It was in Canada. And I think that's really important because it was also, kind of this recognition that Canada territory-wise has the largest Arctic, right? And so obviously this is important. And I think that it's also a relatively easy sell because we know that other countries are already costing their infrastructure and critical security development. For example, Belgium, right? They did massive improvements to their railways since what's going on in Ukraine. And so basically they've kind of costed all of those through defense because the idea is that nothing is, Belgium has become this transfer hub of Mecca and they're efficient. They're something like 98% on time. Like, I think we need to send Via Rail there because we would love 98%. And so, this is one way I think that Canada, we will have to spend a lot of money. We have made major financial commitments there, right? Already to the Arctic and to Northern development. So we're already spending that money. Why not try to put it in that NATO pocket? The second thing is climate change, right? I've alluded to that, but there is much that can be done in terms of mitigation, adaptation of climate change, our defense footprint, defense innovation development, S&T. And so there's lots that could be done there. And Canada is in an interesting position now because countries are looking to Canada to kind of take a leading role since it's hosting this climate change and security center of excellence. And so these two things can kind of be an interesting convergence of opportunity that Canada can, capitalize in some senses on that and make requests to the Center of Excellence that would then require defense spending. And so you're contributing to the alliance, but you're also supporting Canada. And so there's a lot of ways that Canada can kind of use or deploy these types of things. And I also, Diana, so we have a North American Defense Innovation Accelerator of North America, which is in Halifax, right? And so where the Center of Excellence is a bit of like a research institute and does training, the Diana is really the science, technology, innovation end. That's where the money end is, right? And so that's located in Canada. And so there's going to be some opportunities there. But what this really means is that, we have to be preparing Canadians for more defense spending. And that's very difficult because we, at the very same moment that Trudeau has consented to at Vilnius spending more, we also told defense to cut $1 billion, right? And so we are trying to federally constrict, but we also have committed to spend a lot more. And so one of these things has to give, but really it must be an awareness information piece, right? The essentialness of territorial defense before all, because you have to protect the territory of Canada and our sovereignty to have all of those wonderful things like education and healthcare and all of those things that we enjoy. And so, at the end of the day, it really comes down to, in a world in which the certainty of, the United States' support of Canada may be in question, or maybe, I don't want to go far as to say it's in question, but it may be in doubt, right? Canada needs to be looking for that insurance policy. Right. And it's like when you insure your car, right? It's kind of like the insurance, you're betting you're not going to get in an accident, and the insurance company is betting you are, right? Canada simply thinks like we're never going to get in an accident, right? We are not in an environment, and we can do that because we don't think that we're threatened, right? But we need to start thinking that we're in a world where accidents are coming at us. Things are coming at us. Right? And you could be the best driver on the planet and still have something come at you, right? And again, that's where that kind of laziness and are not being reactive enough in learning those lessons is really coming back at us. And, we just kind of see this cycle kind of continue to feed itself.
And the only thing I'd add is on that information piece as well, we keep getting the Trumpian view on what this means rehashed in the media again and again, that it's some kind of a kickback, or we owe dues, and no, it is 2% of our GDP spent on our defense. So as Anessa says, there could be dual use Arctic infrastructure, it could be all sorts of stuff, but almost no matter what, the money is staying in Canada. By and large, it's coming to Canadian companies, especially with Diana. We're going to have a lot more innovation and dual use capacity. everything that's going on in Ukraine is showing people more and more that we need much more nimble and fast acting ability to take technology we've already got and change it into something that can be used in the defense realm. And I think that Canada could be a great leader on that. And so again, I think that we have to look at it as, we're plowing it back into Canada. It's not like it's going somewhere. It's that the problem is that we keep this message of, oh, we're sending money as dues, or that we're sending money out of Canada. I mean, those are two different but linked ideas that I think we just have to make sure is gets dispelled.
Yeah, and just to follow up, like there are no dues for NATO. Again, this is like that public information message. What NATO has is they negotiate every 2 years these common funding agreements, right? And you have to think of it like a pie that has 100%. And so there's a couple of things that are really interesting in the last couple of cycles. So for a long time, and I've followed these agreements for a while, and so for a long time, there was a little bit of a rivalry between the UK and France, where they were kind of like spending extremely close in, because it was a bit of a rivalry within the alliance, right? Neither wanted the other to be able to say, well, I contribute more, so I should have more positions, more role, whatever, right? But what is interesting is after Brexit, the first negotiation that was after Brexit was the 2018 cycle. We saw that France actually let the UK pay more, substantially more. And this distance has only increased, right? So if there's a penalty for Brexit, it means that France is basically now letting the UK pay more for NATO. Right? That's the first thing. The second thing that's relatively interesting is that, again, this goes to Canada as a free rider. Now, these agreements, what they do is they take your previous years, the percent that a country holds of the entire world's GDP, and they compare that versus the German percent of the world GDP, not the US. Germany is the base player for all of these calculations in Europe, right? And so when you actually do that and you do the calculation, Canada is actually one of the very few partners in the alliance that contributes exactly its economic capacity. We are at 99.96%, right? So that means, like, based on what we economically could contribute, we almost contribute 100% of it. Right. And so this is where that discourse about people saying you're not making 2% and so NATO's mad at you. Well, no, we're paying our common funding. That's never an issue. Right. And so this also draws back to the narrative of 2% and when it came, where it came from, when it came from, its purpose. This was about these Central and Eastern countries, Eastern European countries entering the alliance. It was to signal to these countries as a focal point, to kind of guide them towards spending. The logic itself was in a logic of economies that were much smaller. It was never about an economy the size of Canada when they were thinking about 2%. It was about the Central and Eastern European countries. And the first reflection was actually in the 1980s when Spain joined, right? And so Canada is in this place where it's basically it's the NATO partner that would be the most penalized by being forced to reach 2% in real dollars, because it's the largest of the countries that don't make it with the furthest distance to go. So like the Germans don't make it, but they're a lot closer to it. So they would have to spend less in real dollars to make that amount. So basically 2%, Canada is the country that ends up being the most hurt by getting there. Doesn't mean it shouldn't get there. It means that we have to plan how to get there. We have to have a roadmap. And that's now what we're hearing out of Brussels. Canada has to agree to a roadmap to get to 2% by 2030, I suspect. And what that's going to look like, I have no idea. But I mean, right now, I think they want it by 2028. I think Canada's going to be able to push to 2030 because we're so far off, but we're going to have a plan. And it's going to have to be reasonable. We can't just go and say, we're going to get this done. That doesn't really work.
Trust us on this. Trust us on
Yes, right. Trust us.
Well, and I think one of the key things, and Robert really touched on it, but it's like, if you took the 16 or 17 billion dollars, I think Anessa said it was like that, or 19 billion, would put us at 2%. an additional 19 billion or something. Like from the military perspective, I don't know where you would put. Like, you could buy a whole bunch of cool stuff. You could buy all kinds of boats and stuff, but like, great. Like, we don't have the people to put on all the ships. Like, and yes, you could expand, but the thing is, like, what people, one of the things that comes with this is like the CAF writ large is still like has a ceiling. Even if you fill all the positions, like it still has a ceiling that it can't grow beyond because that's just the way it's currently structured. So it's like you put $19 billion in, like you could fill all your vacant positions and you buy a whole bunch of stuff, but you couldn't use a lot of it. Like, which is one of these things, again, like this is the problem of reducing what is actually a nuanced discussion where we're talking about, well, let's talk about some of the other things we do and how this contributes to it, and how do we inject this back into our own economy, which are all good, valid, reasonable, good discussion points, into 2%. Like it's a protection racket. Like, screw that. That's not the point. The point is, like, how are we collectively working towards this? Now, I think the three people here agree that we could certainly do a better job of this. We could come to better decisions internally. We could have a more coherent vision of what we want. We could message this better to our citizens and to our allies. We all agree with that, which I think is reasonable. But like, yes, well, we'll just spend this money. But like on what? What are we going to buy or spend it on to where we're going to get the return on investment that we want? That's going to be good for Canada. That's going to help the alliance. Because the fact is, if you buy 200 M1s that you can't crew and they just park them, well, congratulations. You've contributed your 2%, but you just parked to it. Like, you haven't contributed. You've just bought something from someone else to say that you've spent the money. And it's like, let's spend the money in a usable, reasonable way where we have a plan where it leads to something that we want as a nation that strengthens NATO. And strengthens our place within it. That's my, like, I'm all like, hey, I didn't like, I don't enjoy having to do like my budget cut scrub that I have to do.
Yeah.
And I find, yes, the messaging certainly discordant. But realistically, you know, the CAF, up until recently, the CAF's budget has, you can look, and as a percentage of GDP has consistently been going up slowly, but the CAF has still effectively been unable to generally spend that money to either fill the positions or buy the stuff to put people in, because it's also tied up. Because again, it is not just a simple, here's your MX Black and go buy whatever, right? There's a whole bunch of other considerations. We have, the nuance of domestic procurement and training. And so, like, we keep trying to reduce these questions to like these like little sound bites of 2%, or we'll buy this. Okay, but what does that get us? Does that really achieve what we want, or should we take a more logical, planned explanation of where we want to take this? And I think, again, this is the argument that we need to have, or the discussion we need to have internally and with NATO. Like, how are we going to capture all these costs and what we are contributing in other ways that help the alliance for large?
That's a really good point. I think we're starting to wind down. I'd like to hear some more discussion between our panelists, but before we do that, I have a question. What do you think Canadians should know about NATO that you've learned over your time of interaction with NATO? I don't want to put a lot of pressure on you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say that NATO is important because it provides that fundamental link, not only historic but also pragmatic and practical, that transatlantic link. right? Like we know our history, Canadian history is anchored in Europe, right? But this is that functional, formal agreement which links us in terms of security and defense. So that's the first thing. You know, you know, another thing I would say is that NATO is around us, you know, every day in various ways, right? In terms of, you know, providing those kind of backdoor, you know, and I know that Lieutenant Colonel talked about this, right? That these kind of relationships, the one-on-one relationships with our partners and allies, with the folks in those militaries, right? That creates that trust. And so, you know, and so maybe we ask the counterfactual, would we have such a good understanding, which we think we have, of Europe, of our various partners and allies without NATO, right? Would we have the insight through the UN, for example? Absolutely not, right? In terms of our military training, interoperability, how we can react with partners, you know, the depths of our connections with, you know, I mean, because NATO goes through multiple ministries, it goes through all of our military forces. It's kind of this, it unifies us around these various common missions that are not only the things that we want to protect and defend, like democracy, like the rules-based order, but also, you know, it brings that person-to-person connection. And so I think that those are some of the things, and, you know, and of course, that those things together create and secure the prosperity, which is what Canada is based on. Canada needs economic prosperity and it needs trade. We could not be a prosperous Canada without trade. Yeah. And so being in NATO really kind of helps to secure that order in a way so that Canada can continue to exist, because trade is secured. And so Canada can, you know, kind of continue to have these relations and be integrated in a world economy. In a world in which we relied just on the UN, you know, we would not be as secure. You know, we would not be talking about, you know, the Germans or the French and as our friends and allies, right? And so I think that that's the other thing, is it's given us this level of insight we wouldn't have any other way. It made Canada relevant in the world. Yeah. Would Canada be as relevant as it is without NATO? I don't think so, right? I think we might be a little bit like that ostrich and put our head in the sand a bit. NATO forces us to take our head out and join in with the crowd. And I think that that's a good thing.
We simply can't be Canadian first, kind of thing.
Yeah, and just for me, I'd mention similar things as well. Today was a celebration in Parliament of the 25th anniversary of Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland joining NATO. And they take that very seriously and very proud of it. And it's the kind of thing we should be celebrating. We forget to celebrate our prosperity, our peace, all of those things which we take for granted. It's so difficult to prove or to recognize the negative, you know, the absence of war, and certainly total war. It's really tough to explain that to people. And you sound preachy if you say, oh, you should appreciate what you have. You're not appreciating what you have. But I tell you who does appreciate it. It is that amazing nexus that Anessa and Matthew were talking about, of former servicemen and women, former diplomats, former politicians. There's something called the NATO Parliamentary Association. Julie Zarowitz, MP, here for Toronto. She's the chair of that for Canada, and they go all over the NATO alliance, meeting other parliamentarians, making sure that they have connections, personal relationships. That happens with the diplomats. Maria Vaz Salazar, Her Excellency the Ambassador of Hungary here to Canada. She was working on the file that when NATO brought in Hungary to the alliance. So all of these diplomats, all of these members of the composite militaries and politicians, they all have these long storied kind of a tapestry of relationships that builds NATO. And you won't see it because it's just, hundreds of thousands of individual relationships over decades. But that is the kind of strength that gives you resilience. That's what NATO is all about, being able to deal with whatever comes at it. I love talking to my interns about this because we mentioned the USSR was never mentioned in the NATO treaty. Not one, it's not mentioned at all. It would have been so easy and, in fact, advantageous to have that in there. But instead, they said, no, this is an alliance for us. Anybody who is against us, we're going to defend from. But that could be anything. That could be a zombie apocalypse. It could be aliens. It doesn't matter who the counter is. We're protecting our way of life. And it's that kind of nexus of relationships that kind of articulates it so well. And that's what I discover. Every day you meet another person who says, oh yeah, I used to be at NATO HQ back in the 90s and we were dealing with Kosovo for the first time. That was NATO's shining moment. And, Canadians don't know that. They don't talk about it very much. So that's the one thing that surprises me about NATO all the time. It's just that it's that foundation of resilience is based on personal relationship.
So I think both Anessa and Robert kind of captured what I would say. That's it. It is something that people, again, in their soundbite understanding of it, have a very simplistic view of what it is, and it is just like everything else. This is my inner humanist or whatever, but it's a thing that is made up of people, right? And it's people who all work together. They trust each other. They have shared goals. They have shared values, and they might not agree on everything. Absolutely not. Totally possible. Happens all the time. But they can agree on the things that they see as critically important. So like Robert said, what they saw, what the founders saw as the thing that mattered to them the most, that's what they would come together to protect. Yeah, we can disagree over automaking tariffs or whatever, but this is a non-negotiable thing that we have all agreed on. And I think that, again, we're just terrible at explaining that what it exists, it is 100% a self-protective thing that was created because people thought it was worthwhile to do, this was worth protecting. And when it gets reduced to purely being a debate over just money, I think you're missing, the value of it. And a microcosm of both the points that they raised. So I teach at the Staff College in Kingston. So I teach on an Army, train captains to become staff officers. Big course for the Army, super important. And every year it has a cohort of international students. And some of them are NATO students, and then some of them are from other international partners. So one year we had a student from Latvia, captain from Latvia, and he was great, super motivated, good, just a good captain. You're like, man, you're a great guy, Igor's. And then I'm here with my friend, and we get this thing saying, you're going to go to Latvia to run this training, and we had 3 days notice to deploy, which from the staff college is just ludicrous. The staff college is, we're all professors with patches on our elbows and stuff. We don't do anything like that. And they're like, you have to be there in 3 days. And how that worked was the mission commander for reassurance was my old Squadron 2 IC from back in the day when I was the lieutenant. So I called him. The EFP battle group commander was a lieutenant colonel that I worked with in 1 brigade when I was the G3. And our contact in the Latvian brigade was Captain Igor's. And we were like, hey, Igor's, we need help. And he's like, yeah, I'll get you all hooked up. He stayed and taught 6 courses with us, and he was our guy. But the entire thing, technically not, NATO in that sense, but it's that's the vision of it. I got a guy I can call. We can make this work. We can find a solution. And that's the microcosm of what NATO exists to do, right? I know a guy in the Balkans. We can call them and we can sort something out. We can make this work. And it actually does do it, honestly, remarkably well. In my experience. better sometimes than how like disparate divisions in Canada sometimes interact. They fight more. So I think that's it. Like it's a thing that's just kind of constantly there, and it's just a bunch of people who are all working because they actually do think it's something worth protecting and doing. And I think that is kind of the narrative that sometimes gets lost. It's looked at as like a monolithic organization, and it is in many ways, but it is also individual countries and individual people that are all working towards a collective vision of security to try and make the world better, which is a good thing.
I can't imagine a higher note to end this on. So, like, I mean, that is absolutely fantastic. I think, oh, excuse me again. Yeah, add that to the call. Sorry. Thank you. Mr. Robert Baines, Dr. Anessa Kimball, Lieutenant Governor Matthew Jones. I think you've done so much to illuminate for our audience. I think you've made our challenges within NATO. I think you've made NATO a lot more real and relevant for everyone who's been listening in on the conversation. So, I mean, you've given us a great gift. And on behalf of everyone who's there in the audience, I thank you wholeheartedly. Yay!
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for this. Thank you to our audience for participating, for taking in what's been a really great event. We'll be continuing doing the Zoom events from time to time. There's a national audience for this. In person here in Saskatoon, CIC welcomes India's High Commissioner to Canada on Friday, April 5th. We're still finalizing some of the details on that. We'll get it out on the Saskatoon emails, on the Saskatoon email list. If any of our speakers are interested in hearing what's going on with that, we can add you to the list. So thank you very much. Thank you for everyone. Let's keep on learning about the world and our place in it. Until next time, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.